Count 1, malice murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 2, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 3, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty.
So you decided to do the minimum,
No, that's
1%. That's what you
about to
said.
go there.
Okay, here's the law. That's all we're going to do. In the meantime, you got kids being placed in addresses like a strip club in Jacksonville, Florida.
Mr. Secretary, how can you credibly claim that HHS is working to protect these children? And by the way, children we're talking about in the order of magnitude of 400 and something thousand children.
Guilty. The verdict on the Laken Riley killer trial. He's been convicted of 10 counts. President Trump is celebrating. We've got the reading of the verdict here and then reaction from the New York Times, along with updates of what happened in Congress when Health and Human Services Director Xavier Becerra was hauled in front of the House and asked questions about hundreds of thousands of missing kids that have disappeared as a result of their transportation across the Democrats' wide open border. But a great verdict today. Nothing that's going to bring back the loss of Laken Riley, and peace to the family. When we play this clip, you're going to hear the sobs and the tears in the room. Totally unnecessary death that should have never happened if this person would have not been in our country. Trump responded, said, "Justice for Laken Riley. The illegal who killed our beloved Laken Riley was just found guilty on all counts for this horrific crime. Although the pain and the heartbreak will last forever, hopefully this can help bring some peace and closure to her wonderful family who fought for justice and to ensure that other families don't have to go through what they have. We love you, Laken, and our hearts will always be with you. It is time to secure our border and remove these criminals and thugs from our country so nothing like this can happen again." Now, here's the verdict as it was read in court today, and you'll hear the judge announcing one by one all the way up through 10.
Count 1, malice murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 2, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 3, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 4, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 5, kidnapping with bodily injury, I find the defendant guilty. Count 6, aggravated assault with intent to rape, I find the defendant guilty. Count 7, aggravated battery, I find the defendant guilty. Count 8, obstructing or hindering a 911 call, I find the defendant guilty. Count 9, tampering with evidence, I find the defendant guilty. Count 10, peeping Tom, I find the defendant guilty. I certainly will allow both sides to look at this if you want to do it. The next step is sentencing. I'm prepared to go forward with that now, or if either side suggests that you need a few minutes, hour break or something to do that, I'll certainly do that as well. Consider that.
All right, so they did take a break. You can see the verdict was read, 10 out of 10, guilty, all counts. When they came back, he got sentenced to life in prison. Life sentence for killing Laken Riley. And you like how the New York Times calls him a migrant, just a, innocent migrant who is here to work the fields. Yeah, the sentencing came hours after a judge issued a guilty verdict, and obviously you can see scenes of the just horrific scene in the courtroom. A 26-year-old migrant from Venezuela was convicted on Wednesday. He was an illegal alien who was not supposed to be here. Killed and murdered Laken Riley. She was 22, attacked in February, running on a trail, University of Georgia, entered the country illegally, faced numerous charges. The judge was Patrick Haggard of State Superior Court, found him guilty. It was a 4-day bench trial. The judge, rather than a jury, decided the case. They did not want a jury because they probably thought they were going to lose the case immediately. On Wednesday, lawyers for the murderer said that their decision to seek a bench trial was based on concerns that a jury could not review the evidence dispassionately. Well, the judge didn't buy it either. For months, Riley's name was invoked by conservatives. Trump called Ibarra, the defendant, a monster. In a post on social media, Trump said, "We love you, Laken Riley. We love your family. We pray for you." Now, she was fast. She could have outrun him. But there's another suspect in this case who's taller and more physically fit. So they tried to blame it on someone else. Horrific case. And obviously, just the background is gruesome. So a little sense of justice there. Now, elsewhere in the country, there was a hearing about immigration and about how Health and Human Services Director, Secretary Xavier Becerra, the man who is soon to be replaced by Health and Human Services incoming director, RFK Jr., baby, soon as Trump's in charge, brought his booty down to Congress, and he got asked about those missing 300,000 kids that they cannot find, that we know that they had at one point on a list somewhere, and now they're missing, gone with the wind. Thank you, Kamala and Democrats. So here is this exchange. Xavier Becerra, Health and Human Services, major position, being asked about the missing kids. How can you deliver health and human services when kids are being trafficked across the world?
Secretary Becerra, do your policies at ORR place priority on speedy placement of the unaccompanied child with sponsors or taking care of their safety and protection once they've been placed?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. The safety and well-being of children in our custody is our #1 priority.
Well, so that's important to know because your record indicates that biometrics for sponsors were eased up there. The use of DNA, I'm going to read from your directive from March 22nd, 2021. Use of DNA is only used for the purpose of establishing biological relationships for purposes of sponsorship and is not submitted to law enforcement personnel or run against law enforcement databases. Guess that last part? Not submitted to law enforcement personnel and not run against law enforcement databases. And to get this part, submission of DNA by the parent is voluntary. How in the world does that protect the child, the unaccompanied minor, when actually what you're doing, you're saying the parent, whether you submit to DNA, that's voluntary. So you're going to be taking whoever it is, the sponsor, their word.
They got to just...
So how does that protect the child?
Doesn't.
We use a number of tools to make sure we can identify the child and certainly do the background checks on anyone who wishes to be a sponsor. We always hope that we can get the most direct information about the people who are wishing to sponsor these children. And we use, as you mentioned, a number of techniques, including fingerprinting and DNA on occasion when it helps us to identify
on occasion. And if you don't have the DNA and you don't have the fingerprints, how in the world are you checking the databases for the background? How are you vetting them?
We have a number of techniques that we use to make sure we're...
What are they?
They can include any number of things such as, sometimes it will include fingerprints, it will include a direct interview with the individual, it will be a check on citizenship documents, it will be a...
How often do you use fingerprinting or DNA?
Again, it depends on the type of information we have to identify the individuals who are wishing to sponsor.
Here's another exchange, much on the same topic. They say, what are you doing when it comes to unaccompanied children with sponsors? How are you protecting them to make sure that they're going to people who are legitimate sponsors who are not going to just traffic these kids into some horrific situation?
I just asked the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, do you have a medical degree?
I do not.
You do not have a medical degree.
Okay, good. So RFK
Are you
Jr. doesn't
familiar with
either.
the Florida grand jury presentment that they did about a year and a half ago in 2023 in regards to unaccompanied alien children?
I'm somewhat familiar with it. I was briefed on it on many occasions.
Are you familiar that in that report, it revealed that children were pimped out by their aunt, which it turns out the aunt wasn't even related to the child, the so-called aunt. Are you familiar with that story that was in there?
There are a number of incidents that are reported in that Florida report. Some of them I can probably recall better than others. Some of them I would challenge and dispute, but that one I don't remember.
And do you remember the teenage girl that was in a house with unknown men with no private bedroom for her? Are you familiar with the sponsors that utilize a strip club in Jacksonville as an address for where a child should be settled?
Congressman, as I said, I don't have the information on that Florida grand jury report in front of me. I certainly can go back and take a look at it and try to get back to you.
He won't.
Are you familiar that the case managers are only performing home studies, or the case managers are only doing case studies or home studies in 4.5% of placements in Florida? Only 4.5%. In fact, discretionary home studies were 1%. Is that all you folks are checking up on?
They're
These
not
kids
doing
that
that.
are so vulnerable?
Congress, in passing the laws that apply to the unaccompanied children, said that home studies would be reserved for those children who came to us with circumstances that showed trauma or the need for additional
Just following the law,
services.
man.
So by law, by statute passed by you in Congress, those of you in Congress in the past, we have the obligation to conduct these home studies only in those particular cases. We provide home study.
So you decided to do the minimum.
No, that's
1%. That's
was
what you
about to
said.
go there.
Okay, here's the law. That's all we're going to do. In the meantime, you got kids being placed in addresses like a strip club in Jacksonville, Florida.
Great. The law says when the kids come to us, you're like, what? The kid's going to come to you when they're being exploited at a strip club? They're going to call you and say, hey, I'm being exploited. Can you please come help us? I don't think so. Chip Roy also jumped in, and here's what that sounded like.
Are you familiar with Maria Gonzalez, an 11-year-old girl who lived in Pasadena, Texas? In August 2023, Ms. Gonzalez was allegedly raped and murdered by Juan Carlos Garcia Rodriguez, a Guatemalan national who appealed at the southern border as a UAC in January of 2023 and was 17 years old. A month later, HHS released Garcia Rodriguez to a sponsor with a criminal history and who previously had 2 other UACs in his care, failed to enroll them in school as required by HHS. How about the situation with respect to another individual, Kayla Hamilton? Are you familiar with Walter Javier Martinez? Martinez was a 17-year-old from El Salvador who appeared at the border as a UAC in March of 2022. Months later, in July 22, he raped and murdered Kayla Hamilton, a 20-year-old woman in Maryland. After Martinez's release from the border and before Mrs. Hamilton's tragic death, HHS released him to a sponsor in May of 2022, despite Martinez having gang tattoos and an arrest record for illicit association with MS-13. Mr. Secretary, how can you credibly claim that HHS is working to protect these children? And by the way, children we're talking about in the order of magnitude of 400 and something thousand children, which you are dismissing that they are lost. Let me ask you a very specific question, Mr. Secretary. Can you account for the whereabouts of of those 400 and something thousand children. The 320,000 that were put in the report by the Inspector General, the 85,000 that we've talked about before in 2023. Do you know where all of these children are and that they are safe?
Thank
Yes
you for
or no?
the question, Congressman.
Congressman, as I explained the process, we get these kids when they are referred to us by the Department of Homeland Security. We then provide them with care while they are in our custody. We lose custody of those kids once we find a vetted sponsor with whom they can stay.
A vetted sponsor that rapes and murders the people that they're entrusted to because you issue a rule that doesn't even do the background check? That's what you think is appropriate care for these children?
Brutal. All right, so that's Health and Human Services. Thanks for subscribing and joining us as our coverage continues.